The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. Our topic today, policy challenges in fragile states. As recent events in Mali have demonstrated, when governments lose effective control over their territories, other forces quickly fill the vacuum. Since 9/11, U.S. policymakers have viewed places lacking a strong central government as ungoverned security threats. Some analysts, however, question the notion of ungoverned areas, suggesting that where formal governance breaks down, localized or informal governance structures tend to emerge. In this conceptual framework, threats come from not the absence of a strong central authority, but from the way a place is governed. To discuss the policy responses that flow from this alternative analysis, we're joined today by Robert Lamb, Senior Fellow and Director of the Program on Crisis, Conflict, and Cooperation at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Robert Lamb, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I wonder if we could just start out with a look at how 9/11, that really was sort of a watershed in many ways of the way this notion of ungoverned spaces was reviewed. I mean, previously it was much more of a humanitarian issue, wasn't it?
Yeah, for many decades, there have been a lot of people who have been concerned about poverty and social exclusion and human rights violations in places where governments were weak and where there was violence and conflict. But when 9/11 happened, when the United States was attacked from a group of terrorists who were based in one of these places, based in Afghanistan, what a lot of people realized was that places where there is a good deal of social exclusion and weak governance and very weak links to the rest of the world can be places where criminal networks, terrorist networks, insurgent groups, and so on can live fairly freely. They can plan there, they can exploit resources, they can be involved in criminal activities to raise money, they can train and recruit from local populations, and in short, they can be sources of threat to the rest of the world. But the problem was that they're so inaccessible and we know so little about them that it wasn't really clear what we could do about them. And so I think one of the first instincts that certainly American policymakers had after 9/11 was to try to figure out how to get the central governments in these areas to control the places that were not controlled by the central governments. And if the reason these areas were uncontrolled was because they just didn't have the capacity to control it, they were just too weak, then maybe we should build their capacity. But if the problem was they didn't want to, for whatever reason, then we needed to come up with new ways of building their political will. The problem with this is that the places that they were referring to as ungoverned, well, they were never really ungoverned. People lived there. People have lived there for a very long time. And even if they did not have a relationship with the central government, that did not mean that there was no governance there. If you try to build the capacity of the central government to move into these places and start to govern them and start to control them, you're at least as likely to trigger a conflict with the central government as you are to stabilize the place, and you're probably more likely, in fact.
So what are the metrics typically used? I mean, how do we put that label on a place as a fragile state?
So the fragile states are commonly understood to be places where the government is too weak to control its entire territory. The economy is usually bad. The government institutions are either non-existent or too weak to really provide the services and security that's expected of a modern state. we have a bit of a misconception about what fragile states are. For one thing, most of them have never really been states as we understand them. Americans use the word state to mean Wisconsin or New Jersey. Political scientists and social scientists use the word state to mean what we mean by a country. Places like Mali, as you pointed out, or Afghanistan, and lots of places in Africa as well, were never really fully functioning states to begin with. They have always had weak institutions, and most of them have had their borders drawn by outsiders. So the people who live there don't even really always see themselves as part of the same country. So talking about them as if they were a coherent unit that just needed to be strengthened somewhat and then everything would be fine was not quite the right way to think about the problem. They were fragile for a reason. If there are ungoverned areas, which is to say if there are areas within the state that are not controlled by the central government, there's almost always a reason for that. It often has to do with historical tensions. There are different ethnic groups. They were never part of the same country to begin with, but now there's competition over the resources that might exist in different areas of the country. And so by putting them all together into one country, we're calling them a state, but they're not.
So if we see places sort of post 9/11 through this lens of safe havens, of there's not sufficient control to prevent bad guys from operating with impunity there, does that determine which situations like this are really of strategic concern to the U.S.? I mean, are there places that are, quote, failed or failing that we have no strategic interest in and therefore aren't much interested in engaging with?
Let me separate those two questions out. Let me talk a little bit about safe havens first, and then I'll talk a little bit about how the United States interacts with places like this. Safe havens are areas of the world, and there's lots of them, where criminal groups, non-state groups, terrorist organizations, whatever actors who are doing things that the rest of the world consider to be harmful behaviors. It's where they can operate essentially with impunity. Usually because there's a weak central government. In some cases, they actively undermine the strength of the state by engaging in a war with the state. Not because they want to take over the state, but because they just want to weaken the state. You see this, for example, in Mexico with the Sinaloa and Juarez cartels. They're in a war with the state not because they want to control Mexico, but because they just want the state to be too weak to undermine their activities. So if you have places like that, if you have places like the Fatah in Pakistan on the border with Afghanistan, where no outsiders really know what's going on in there and don't really have the capacity to govern or control or sometimes even enter there, how do you deal with places like that? Well, the answer is you almost can't. There's not very much you can do. Trying to strengthen the central government to impose more control can trigger a conflict in the area. Whereas trying to go to locals and building up their capacity is, you would have to bypass the central government to do that. And that's diplomatically a very difficult, in some cases legally, a very difficult thing to do. So they pose really serious dilemmas for policymakers who are concerned about these transnational illicit threats. Now, the United States' relationships with safe havens, with fragile states, with conflict areas in general, it's a little bit complicated. We've done some research at CSIS looking at major political crises in countries since 1989. And one of the things that we found is well, there's a lot of them. About every 2.5 weeks on average, there's a new major internal political crisis happening somewhere in the world. There is no way the United States can deal with all of them. We absolutely do not have the capacity every 2.5 weeks to take some kind of an action in some country, somewhere in the world, to try to influence internal stability and try to find a way to maybe pick a winner or stabilize the situation or remediate. But That said, every couple of months, on average, we do try to do something. There have been about 400 major political crises since 1989. 4/5 of them we have not intervened in. But we have tried to intervene every few months in them. That usually means sending diplomats, sending aid, imposing sanctions, arms embargoes, mediating somehow. Every once in a while, it also involves our sending troops. There's not really all that much of a pattern to where we pick to intervene. Sometimes we intervene in places because there's a humanitarian disaster happening, and say if it's in Africa, for example, the governments are too weak. It's not really within China's or Russia's or Iran's sphere of influence, so we're not really all that constrained in what we can do. And so if we can help by providing some sort of humanitarian aid, we do. But if it's in a part of the world that's in China's or Russia's sphere of influence, or if it's in the Middle East where we already have fraught relations, we're much less likely to intervene in a really particularly forceful way.
So, are there discernible criteria then? I mean, where is it humanitarian? Does it rise to a certain level of humanitarian crisis that triggers a response, or is it much more sort of on the realist or idealist continuum? Is it just realpolitik, where we have an interest intervening here, we don't there, despite the fact that they're suffering in both places?
The answer is it depends. The U.S. decisions about what crisis situations to intervene in, it's not, I don't think you can really argue that there's a real pattern that we always intervene when it's a humanitarian crisis above a certain threshold of deaths, or we always intervene in a country where, certain concerns about, nuclear terrorism or, access to trade routes or something are imperiled. What the United States does when it's faced with a situation, it looks at what is our relationship with that country, what's our relationship with the government and the people of that country, what do the people think about us, what are our interests, what is our relationship built upon? Is it built mainly upon trade? Is it built mainly upon we leave each other alone? Is it built mainly upon our concern for terrorists or nuclear development? Is it a realpolitik situation where we want to be involved in a certain part of the world because it can displace Iran's influence? So yes, we consider interests. But Americans also have a very long history of caring about American values, where there's where people are dying, where there's a humanitarian crisis, where there are gross human rights violations taking place, or where democracy is threatened, or where there's an opportunity for democracy to emerge. Americans have a tendency to want to help in those situations, and sometimes we actually do. So we do take interests into consideration, we do take values into consideration, but we also take constraints into consideration. And the truth is that we can't act everywhere. There are places where if we were to take some set of actions, it would anger China so much that it would imperil that relationship. The same in Russia. And it could do so in ways that could threaten other priorities. Russia and China both have a veto in the Security Council. Well, they could use that veto for a completely unrelated issue if we try to intervene in an area that they might consider as part of their sphere of influence.
Well, I think we'll leave it at that. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, I'd like to talk a little bit more about what the alternatives to engaging with the central government might be. But first, we'll take a short break. We'll be back.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking about policy challenges in fragile states with Robert Lamb. Well, at the outset, we talked a little bit about sort of the typical traditional response has been, we'll just beef up the strong central government and that should take care of the problem. You're taking an alternative view where perhaps that's not the best course, and in fact, there are no ungoverned states, that there's some form of governance. So, as a matter of policy, is it possible for the U.S. to engage with those alternative governance structures rather than the folks at the Capitol?
Well, first of all, I should be very clear that yes, in some circumstances, we should be working with the central government. It's in the system in the international system as it's set up today, you bypass the central government of any country at your peril. There are serious diplomatic repercussions to doing that. The United States has laws about the sorts of people that you can and cannot interact with. There's also diplomatic practices and diplomatic sensitivities, and there are political risks inherent in bypassing the central government. So there are times when it happens. Certainly drone strikes in Pakistan and perhaps other places might qualify as times when, despite the opinions of the central government, there is a need to act. Certainly the raid to get Osama bin Laden was a very good example of that. But there are also times when you have to recognize that the central government is not necessarily going to be a reliable partner, for one thing. And for another, it's not always going to be a capable partner. When you have situations such as you mentioned Mali at the beginning, almost a year ago there was a coup in Mali in which a democratically elected president was overthrown. And so, now there's a civil war. It's very difficult for the United States to work either with the central government because there was a coup a year ago, or without the central government because it is the government. There's not a really easy solution to that. That said, it is possible to recognize that at various levels, there are people who have interests and power and control. And a lot of the time, there are people in the central government who have relationships with them. There are ways of managing that. Let me give you an example of a situation where the United States had some real interests. And we worked with the central government mainly to strengthen their capacity to deal with the situation. But where locals also took advantage of that situation to stabilize it themselves. And this example is Medellin, Colombia. Medellin, Colombia was, most of us know it as the heart and soul of Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel. But in fact, it was also the site of urban guerrilla warfare. The rural insurgency that had been going on in Colombia for many decades had reached the city of Medellin, Colombia. And so the violence in that city was drug-related, it was insurgency-related, and it was just common crime and oftentimes people defending themselves. Well, three things happened over the course of 10 years to bring the level of violence down from where it was once the most violent place in the world to where the murder rate was lower than Washington, D.C. The first thing that happened was that the Colombian security forces professionalized. Their capacity was built up, in many cases, largely due to the partnership of Colombia with the United States, to the point where they were finally defeating insurgent groups in battle. And they were finally able to do that. In Medellin, this meant that they were finally able to defeat the last of the leftists who were in Medellin. But then, two, there was sort of an implicit, there's conspiracy theories that it was explicit, but an implicit partnership with some drug gangs that were in Medellin, Colombia, who also wanted the leftists out because they were competitors. So the leftists were ejected. The people who remained, the paramilitary narco-trafficker alliance within Medellin, Colombia, demobilized through a government program that was meant for paramilitaries in a way that amounted to the government's co-optation of this group of actors who they could not defeat. So step one was they defeated the leftists. Step two was they co-opted the remaining actors who they were not able to defeat. Well, then step 3 was the city of Medellin itself, which was not necessarily involved in either of those 2 earlier steps, saw a window of opportunity. Once the narco traffickers had demobilized, violence plummeted, and they used that opportunity to build up a relationship with the people who lived in the so-called ungoverned slums of Medellin, and that relationship had never existed before. To me, this was not a coherent strategy on anyone's part. It was not designed. It just kind of happened this way. But I think it holds very important lessons for how the United States and how any other outsiders have to think about the dynamics taking place within fragile states and within safe havens. There are going to be some so-called bad guys who you can defeat, but there's going to be some who you can't defeat. The ones you can't defeat, you have to do something with them. Finding a way to co-opt them, finding a way to make sure that their behavior is not counterproductive is going to be important. And then after that, locals will figure out the rest on their own.
So, we've seen some examples, as you said, about a fifth where that kind of engagement takes a military form. But what about the civilian engagement? I mean, what are the tools that any administration has in these situations on the civilian side?
Well, actually, let me clarify. The United States does not intervene at all in 4/5 of these major political crises. The 1/5 where we do intervene, that's almost all civilian power. Only about 1/3 of those involves military force, and some of those are arms transfers or arms embargoes. The United States actually uses troops on the ground as a means of intervening in foreign crises, relatively speaking, very rarely. When you look at the full spectrum of call them opportunities to intervene. We take very few of those opportunities. Most of the time, the United States is sending civilians to do the job. We're sending diplomats to try to mediate. We're sending development workers to try to figure out if there's any way that development projects might help to sort of relax some of the grievances, to address some of the grievances taking place. Sometimes civilian power takes a harder form in the form of sanctions and arms embargoes and that sort of thing. So most of the time the United States does engage in civilian intervention when it engages in intervention. Unfortunately, I think the disconnect between supply and demand is pretty severe. The demand for civilian power is certainly there. As I said, about every 2 months, the United States is using civilian power to try to influence some foreign crisis. It's not entirely clear to me that civilian institutions have all of the support that they need to do that.
So what kinds of institutions would be involved?
So, the State Department, USAID, even the Commerce Department, the Justice Department, Treasury, they all have tools that the United States can and does use fairly regularly to try to influence the outcomes of crises. Most of the time, the influence that we try to bring to bear is to stabilize the situation, to reduce violence, and then try to make things better. But I think there's a lot of frustration, I think on all sides, on the part of Congress, who thinks, I think sometimes that civilian tools are not as effective as they could be. But I think there's a lot of frustration as well on the civilian side, who feel like they don't always get the support they need. They have far fewer resources than the military, for example.
And do you find these days in the military, the military is beginning to come to grips with the fact that perhaps these are not the kinds of things they're best handled to do?
I think within the military is so big that there are factions, there's always been a faction who has believed that the military can play a larger role in sort of soft power projection of the United States. And they were certainly on the upswing during the surge in Iraq, and as we redeveloped our counterinsurgency doctrine and the surge in Afghanistan as well. There's a bit more of a retrenchment on the military side, and the factions within the military who think that, well, the military shouldn't necessarily be involved in that sort of thing. That's more of a civilian job. The military is better equipped and better used for some more of the hard power things. I think those factions are probably a bit more on the upswing today, given the outcomes of Iraq and Afghanistan and the frustrations there. That said, there are, as I said, the military is very large, and there are a lot of people in the military who want American civilian power to be a lot stronger. And there's been a lot of support from the Defense Department, for the State Department, for USAID to get that power.
So we've got probably 30 seconds left. What is your advice in the second Obama administration to deal with these situations?
My main advice would be we have to have a very realistic and I think modest understanding of what we can accomplish in the kinds of places that we refer to as fragile states, and in the kinds of crises that we see in places such as Syria and Mali and elsewhere, particularly in the Arab world today. We're a strong country. People want us to play a productive role, but we have to recognize that there are limits to what we can accomplish.
Well, we'll have to leave it at that. Robert Lamb, thank you very much. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,